And we back, and we back, and we back. Even better than I was the last time, baby. Okay. Anyways, in all seriousness, let's talk about how cooked the Memphis Grizzlies are. This ain't a timeline video, but I'm going to give a little bit of backstory to why the Memphis Grizzlies are where they're at this point. So it's going to be like a little bit of me explaining what's been going on and all that stuff. You guys get the drill. But anyways, after the 2017 NBA season, Zach Randolph made his way to the Sacramento Kings after spending, I think it was like 7-8 seasons with the Memphis Grizzlies, where he really made his mark on the team and the city as well. And in 2017, they ended up drafting Dillon Brooks from the University of Oregon, who everybody knows who he is at this point. He's a gritty 3-and-D player. He's up there with guys like Bobby Portis and Patrick Beverly. Arguably, you could say Draymond Green, even though some people say he's unlikable. And some people say Dillon Brooks is unlikable, but he's up there with those type of guys. And in the 2018 NBA draft, they used that draft selection. I think they had the number 4 overall pick at the time to get Jaren Jackson Jr. from Michigan State. And Jaren Jackson Jr. is one of the better, well, I don't want to say he's one of the better, but he is a good defensive power forward. And I think he was a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. I believe in 2023, I think he won that award. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And in that 2018-19 season, they ended up getting rid of Marc Gasol at the 2019 trade deadline, and then they moved Mike Conley to the Utah Jazz in the 2019 offseason, ultimately ending the grit and grind era that brought a lot of hope and joy to Memphis all those years. And in the 2019 draft, they had the number 2 overall pick, which they used to select Ja Morant. At the time, Ja was compared to Derrick Rose and Russell Westbrook, 2 guys that are freakishly athletic guards that can jump out the building, that can dunk on your head, can come up with some of the most electrifying plays out there. But unfortunately, just like those two, Ja wasn't the most fundamentally sound player. Just like Russ and D Rose, Ja really didn't have that much of a reliable jump shot. Even though it sort of got better as his career progressed, it still kind of stayed the same. It really only peaked during the 2021-22 season. We'll get to that when we'll get to that, though. But in spite of that, the selection of Ja Morant signified a new era in Memphis basketball. Ja ended up winning Rookie of the Year in 2019-2020, and they even qualified for the bubble. Unfortunately, that Grizzlies team in the bubble got outed in the play-in tournament, which was like in its early stages back then, by Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, and the Portland Trailblazers in overtime. Oh, and I forgot to mention this when talking about the 2018 offseason. They also got Kyle Anderson from the San Antonio Spurs via free agency. And then in the 2019 draft, they drafted Brandon Clark at number 21 overall. Brandon Clark is a nice energy forward center. Pretty nice quality big to have come off your bench. And then they got John Conchar, who went undrafted, who was a decent shooter. But anyways, going back to the timeline, in the 2020 draft, they got the Boston Celtics number 30 overall pick, to which Boston selected Desmond Bane from TCU. Everybody knows the player Desmond Bane is at this point. Good shot creator, good shooter, pretty solid defender, and a guy that could get to the rim at will. And after all that, the Grizzlies had their young core of the future, and a new era in Memphis was starting to form. And they had a coming-of-age type of year during the 2020-2021 campaign, where they were the number 9 seed in the West, but ultimately they punched their ticket into that playoffs, coming up with big statement wins. Number 1 against the DeMar DeRozan, DeJounte Murray-led San Antonio Spurs in the first game of the play-in tournament, and they clinched a big-time win in San Francisco, beating Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors for that final number 8 spot. But they ultimately got waxed by the number 1 seeded Jazz, but everything was looking bright in Memphis. Ja Morant, in those 5 games, looked like he was a superstar in the making. He averaged 30 a game. Dillon Brooks and Jaren Jackson Jr. were starting to become staples of that team as gritty defenders. Desmond Bane looked like a really good offensive player. Overall, that nucleus between Ja, Bane, Dillon Brooks, and Jaren all looked like solid players, and it looked like Memphis was only going to get better from here. And ultimately, they did get better. They were the number 2 seed in the West in the 2021-22 campaign. I think Ja was in running for MVP that year. But also, Memphis had a really good amount of depth as well. They had DeAnthony Melton at the time, who is now on the Golden State Warriors, ironically. Solid 3-and-D guy and a solid ball handler to have off your bench. Tyus Jones was a really good compliment next to Ja Morant. And by the way, they did get him in the 2019 offseason. I forgot to address that as well. They had a bunch of young talent and solid vets and really good role players during that season, which is why they became the number 2 seed in the West. I forgot to mention, in that 2021 offseason, they traded for Steven Adams. They got rid of Jonas Valanciunas, who they got from the Toronto Raptors when I mentioned that they traded Marc Gasol to Toronto. But back to the subject at hand, obviously Memphis was a great team, But unfortunately, the playoffs is where the wheels kind of started falling off. Yeah, they got out of round one versus the Minnesota Timberwolves, but the Timberwolves struggled against the LA Clippers in that play-in tournament, and this was a young Anthony Edwards at the time. He's not the Ant we know now. Jay McDaniels is not the Jay McDaniels we know now. Nas Reed's not the Nas Reed we know now. They had Patrick Beverley at the time. This is before they had Mike Conley, and then they added guys like Rudy Gobert, and later on Dante DiVincenzo, and they flipped Karl Towns for Julius Randle. This was a young Wolves team that was not the most mature. But at the same time, Memphis showed their immaturity as well because they fell down 26 twice in the same playoff game, and somehow they came out of that game 3 in Minnesota with a W. If I'm not mistaken, this is probably the second time in NBA history where a team has come back down 26 points twice in a single playoff game. If I'm not mistaken, the Cleveland Cavaliers with LeBron and Kyrie came back down 20 plus points twice against the Paul George-led Pacers in 2017. And arguably, most of these games were close when they should have been runaways, and it came down to a final possession in Game 5, and it came down to the last few possessions and critical mistakes by the Minnesota Timberwolves in that Game 6. Ultimately, the Memphis Grizzlies were able to escape round 1. And the second round is where things fell off for Memphis completely. They faced the Golden State Warriors, who they eliminated in the play-in the year prior. Difference is, they had Klay Thompson fully healthy and recovered after 2 years of dealing with an ACL and an Achilles injury. Andrew Wiggins was fully acclimated with that Warrior system. Draymond Green had a resurgent year. Kevon Looney had a resurgent year as well. I think he was a starting big at the time. And then they had guys like Otto Porter Jr. and Nemanja Bjelica. So the Memphis Grizzlies had a tall order. The Warriors were a number 3 seed, and to some people, they did not look like a championship caliber team. Memphis looked like, or a lot of people thought Memphis was better at the time. And apparently there was a lot of controversy in that series, starting with the Gary Payton injury. I think Dillon Brooks commits a hard foul. Gary Payton ends up landing on his elbow, and it ended up messing up his elbow. I don't know what the injury was, but going back to the series, Golden State not only gets a critical Game 1 win in Memphis, but they end up going 3-1 as well. Unfortunately for Memphis, Ja Morant suffers a knee injury. I believe he collided with Gary Payton. I think it was like a knee-to-knee contact or something like that. I don't know exactly what happened there. I'm going to have to watch the play again, and I can update y'all in the comments if I can. But regardless, that knee injury sidelined Ja for the rest of the series, and even though they did get a Game 5 win in Memphis, blowing the doors off of Golden State will return the favor by eliminating them in Game 6. But regardless, just like last year, this Memphis team was a young team on the rise, and it looked like they were ready to be more serious about their game, and they were ready to be legit contenders in the Western Conference. But the 2022-23 season ended up being a controversy-ridden season for the Grizzlies. Starting with their immature post-game interviews, a lot of people took issue of them showboating during interviews. For example, there was a regular season game where they ended up beating the Minnesota Timberwolves, again, in a regular season game, and these guys were acting like they won the championship, and a lot of people thought it looked obnoxious and immature. And it would only get worse from here because they ended up facing Golden State in a Christmas Day game. Dillon Brooks and Klay Thompson were exchanging a lot of trash talk. And I think once Klay scored on Brooks, Klay was holding up 4 fingers to him, obviously signifying that he has 4 rings. Obviously, he did to Devin Booker a few games prior. Obviously, I made a separate video talking about it. You guys can look at it at my old timeline. That was like my last video before I took a 2-year hiatus from YouTube. I talked about the Ja Morant controversy regarding a certain weapon that he was brandishing and he was flashing on IG Live. I think he was in a Denver nightclub, but that got him suspended. A lot of news outlets were talking about it, and then he was caught brandishing that said weapon again in another Instagram live video. I think he was in his friend's car, I believe. I don't know. That whole situation was really sketchy, but everybody was saying, like, Ja, you are not a gangster. You are not like that. You are not from those areas. So why are you acting like, as a professional athlete, too, making millions of dollars off of endorsements? Why are you acting like that? And I remember a lot of people were making a fuss about it because, remember, that same season, Nike dropped Kyrie Irving because not only his stance on the vaccine back in 2021-22, I should say, but the thing about the anti-Semitic film, that riled up a lot of emotions, I should say, for lack of a better wording. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to keep the focus on Ja Morant and the Grizzlies that year. And it didn't help that the Memphis Grizzlies were an immature team, like I said. And to add more insult to injury for the Memphis Grizzlies, Ja, in an exclusive interview, I believe it was that season or during 2021-22, I'm sure it was 2022-23, where he literally told, I think it was Malika Andrews at the time, I'm fine in the West. And then in another post-game interview, he was yelling out, "It's a parade inside my city, yeah!" So, the Grizzlies That's how you can tell where the Grizzlies were, at least from a maturity standpoint. And they really started showing their true colors to the NBA public, which caused a lot of fans who are not Grizzlies or Ja fans to say, yo, all this showboating is cute, but at the end of the day, if you don't fess up and mature, the mature teams with a lot of playoff experience are going to kick your butts when it matters most. And guess what happened? They got their crap absolutely kicked in by LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and the Los Angeles Lakers, especially as a number 2 seed. Obviously, anyone who watches basketball knew the Lakers were going to win that series because LeBron and AD were more mature than that whole entire Grizzlies team combined. Obviously, Memphis was competitive for a little bit. They were down by a lot in Game 3. They almost made a comeback, and they led for most of Game 4, but we ended up pulling it out in overtime, and then we absolutely embarrassed them in Game 6, ironically by 40 points, because Dillon Brooks was trash-talking LeBron, and he says, I don't respect nobody until they give me 40. And guess what? His team got 40-pieced all the way to Cancun. And honestly, after all that, the Grizzlies never really recovered from that series because not only they lose Dillon Brooks to free agency, they got Marcus Smart via a trade from the Boston Celtics, and then they got Derrick Rose, who was going to serve as the ultimate mentor for Ja Morant, not only in terms of basketball play, but in terms of mental maturity. You know what I'm saying? So they got that, but unfortunately, they ended up missing the playoffs. Ja Morant, I forgot to touch on this. After the Grizzlies got eliminated, Ja ended up serving a 25-game suspension. I think it was another controversy with a gun, or I alluded to that earlier. But regardless, he missed a huge amount of the 2023-24 season. He ultimately came back by the time it was Christmas time, but he only played 9 games, and obviously nothing else really happened outside of Memphis just sucking the whole entire year, and they ended up missing the playoffs entirely. But even in that season where the Memphis Grizzlies sucked, they had a lot of promising young talent, starting with Gigi Jackson, who looked like a pure shooter, and then they got Jalen Wells from Washington State, who looked like he was going to be the perfect replacement for Dillon Brooks because Jalen Wells was an absolute dog of a defender. I think if there was a rookie defensive first team, Jalen Wells would definitely be within that category. You know what I mean? So they had some promising young talent, and Scottie Pippen Jr. looked like he was going to be the perfect replacement for Tyus Jones. Obviously, that changed now with the Desmond Bane trade, but I will get into that. And I think Steven Adams in that same offseason where Dillon Brooks went to Houston, Steven Adams went to Houston as well. I don't know if he was traded there or he signed there via free agency, but they lost him too. But Memphis got Zach Edey, who was our premier big man at Purdue, had a lot of great games. Obviously, when he faced Donovan Clingan, UConn ended up winning that game. In the 2024-25 season, Memphis looked like a shell of themselves. They were not the same team that was winning 50-plus games. They looked really average, and Ja, even though he shot a little better from the free throw line, he really never progressed as a player. Ja Morant only played 50 games, and in the games he did play, a lot of fans were like, Ja Morant is playing unusually passive and he doesn't look like he wants to take over the games and he wants to defer to Jaren Jackson Jr. That season, he averaged only 23.2, which was his lowest output since the 2020-2021 season where he only averaged 19.1. And on top of all of that, the Memphis Grizzlies ended up firing Taylor Jenkins with 10 games to go in the season, and Taylor Jenkins was another reason why the Memphis Grizzlies were so good during that time frame between 2021-22 and 2022-23. But even after all that, the Memphis Grizzlies were still in playoff contention. They had to go to San Francisco once again to face Golden State in the play-in. This time, Golden State had Steph and Jimmy Butler. Klay Thompson made his way to Dallas and all that other stuff. But unlike 2021, Golden State got even with them, beating Memphis in overtime. But the Grizzlies ultimately clinched the number 8 spot, beating the Dallas Mavericks, who traded Luka, and they were without Kyrie Irving, and it was just Anthony Davis by himself. But they ultimately faced the Oklahoma City Thunder in the first round, where they ultimately got swept. They actually could have had a more competitive series, at least 1 to 2 more games, if Ja Morant didn't go down with a hip injury, because if you guys saw the play, I think Scottie Pippen was trying to throw a lob off the glass. Lou Dort undercuts Ja. Ja fell on his hip. And unfortunately, that was it for Ja, and unfortunately, it was it for Memphis' season, even though they kept it competitive, but they ultimately blew a 29-point lead in Game 3, and then even though they got a close Game 4, they ultimately got swept. 2 months later, the Memphis Grizzlies traded Desmond Bane to the Orlando Magic for KCP, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I have my own separate video talking about that trade. I'm not going to reiterate that whole entire video here because the video is going to be longer than it needs to be. But in the case of Ja, they made it clear that the franchise wants to move forward with Ja Morant, not Des Bane. And I did address some positives that came out of that trade. If you're Memphis, it gave Scottie Pippen Jr. a bigger role, which we saw what he can do if you give him a chance. We saw what he did in Game 4 versus OKC. He had 30 points even though he fouled out. He looked like he could be a good replacement for Des Bane. And then you factor in the improving play of Jalen Wells. And you also bring in a champion in KCP who's been in winning environments, and he can bring a winning mentality and attitude to a young Grizzlies team that has desperately needed it, which is why I wanted KCP on the Pistons instead of Duncan Robinson. And then I said the stuff I said about Klay Thompson and Andrew Wiggins and all of them. But I'm not talking about the Pistons. I want to keep it about the Grizzlies. But ultimately, the trade-off of that is that you're losing key players within your nucleus that was supposed to be what OKC is right now. You lose Brooks, you lose Bane, you lost a guy like Steven Adams, who was essentially the Isaiah Hartenstein to y'all team, you know what I'm saying? Again, after all that, Ja Morant sustained an ankle injury, and Jaren Jackson could be possibly out for the season opener for Memphis because he has a turf toe. They should definitely be back at the early parts of the season, but even after all that, the point is, not only the Memphis Grizzlies are getting the injury bug to their key players, but it felt like the Memphis Grizzlies not only fell from grace, but they never really hit their stride because major roster overhauls every year. In truth, it kind of happened in 2022 when they lost Kyle Anderson to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and then the year after they lost Tyus Jones to free agency as well. So not only Memphis lost a lot of their depth, they lost a lot of their key players that are considered to be part of their future. And obviously Brandon Clark suffered an Achilles injury in 2023, and it hasn't looked like he's been the same player ever since. He's been out almost every season, especially when Memphis needed him most. And I hate to say it because I want to see Ja succeed because the guy is an incredibly talented player, and he's one of the more entertaining players in our league. But unfortunately, if things continue the way they go, we're not going to see the Memphis Grizzlies that we've seen in 2021-22 and 2022-23. And it doesn't help that you're in a tough Western Conference too if you're the Memphis Grizzlies. You have to deal with SGA and the Thunder and Edwards and the Wolves, who are better. Even as much as I slander the Golden State Warriors for being old as heck, and same with the Clippers too, I'm going to make my video about them, talking about them as a team. Those four teams are better. The Lakers, even with Luka, are better. The Dallas Mavericks with Cooper Flag, AD, and Kyrie when he returns, they're better as well. Denver got better. So I don't see the Memphis Grizzlies being that same Memphis Grizzlies that everyone thought they were going to be. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Memphis fell off a cliff, and they're cooked. They're officially cooked. There's no going back after what happened in 2022-23, where that was the season that ultimately broke Memphis, and then the choke against Oklahoma City, being up 29 in Game 3 and then ultimately getting swept. That was the nail in the coffin for any hope of the Grizzlies of being true contenders, if that makes sense. But I want to leave it up to you guys. What do you guys think of the Memphis Grizzlies? Do you guys think they should move on from Ja Morant? Do you think they should move on from Jaren Jackson Jr.? Do you guys feel like they still can contend in the West? Do you guys think they should blow it up entirely? And what do you guys think of the Desmond Bane trade? Do you guys think they made a mistake trading him? And do you guys think they're going to ultimately blow it up at some point, even if it has to be in the middle of the season? Whatever you guys think, please leave your thoughts and comments down below. More videos coming soon. The NBA season starts in a week, and I'm super excited. I can't wait to advance with this content, you know what I'm saying? But until then, that is the end of this video. I'm X. Deuces.